So good afternoon and welcome to the continuation of our Wednesdays at the Center series on John Hope Franklin and global anti-racism. Today's presentation is titled A Luta Continua, The Struggle Continues, Anti-Racism in South Africa and the US with Dr. Anne-Maria Makhulu. Please remember to keep yourselves muted, but you can keep your cameras on and share comments or questions in the chat for our Q&A portion. And now let us welcome Dr. Charlie Piot, co-director of the Africa Initiative and professor of cultural anthropology and African American studies, who will share introductory remarks and introduce our speaker.
It's a privilege for me to introduce my cultural anthropology and African American studies colleague, Anne-Maria Makhulu. Professor Makhulu does research in South Africa, where she's originally from, and has an important first book, Making Freedom, Apartheid, Squatter Politics, and the Struggle for Home, Duke Press book from 2015, about the lives and resistances of Black township residents under apartheid in Cape Town. Before that, she co-edited a generative and widely cited volume, Hard Work, Hard Times, Global Volatility and African Subjectivities, published with California Press in 2010. She's currently working on a manuscript entitled South Africa After the Rainbow, Aspiration, Ambition, and Social Mobility, about the Black middle class in South Africa. And she's also publishing on South African financial markets. Finally, she's at work on an important citational project, looking at the frequency with which white anthropologists cite or don't cite Black female authors and anthropologists, a project clearly tied into the urgencies of the current moment. She has an abiding interest in anti-racism struggles in South Africa and the US, which is the topic of her talk today. Welcome, Professor Makhulu.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks to the organizers, to Meredith and Julie, and of course to the Franklin Center, which is my original home. When I arrived at Duke in 2005, I had an office in the old Franklin Center, and at that time was aligned exclusively with African and African American studies, later went on to have a joint appointment with cultural anthropology. So I'm quite nostalgic for the days of the old Wednesdays at the Center, meetings that we had face-to-face, and of course the wonderful lunches, and as I was told in the very beginning, a free flow of coffee, which of course doesn't happen any longer, certainly not in these times. So what I think I'm going to do is explain a little bit about a project I've been working on, which my understanding should have been released. It's supposed to be released before the election next week. I think the release date was supposed to be October 15, but I find no digital trace of it. This is for the journal Safundi, which is a comparative journal of South African and United States studies. A number of us had been called about, I think, 6 months ago to think about comparisons between the United States and South Africa. And I decided to throw in a third category, which was the UK. So this represents all three of my citizenships. I have a British passport, South African passport, and an American passport. And I wanted to explore some of the parallels and the kind of parallel problematics across the United States, South Africa, and Britain. I went on to write an essay entitled Trump, Zuma, Brexit, Anti-Black Racism and the Truth of the World. And the idea was to try and align what I thought was the kernel problem that sat at the heart of those three entities. So in two cases, it's, President Trump, former President Jacob Zuma of South Africa, and then the Brexit process in the United Kingdom, and how I saw these as being in some ways structured by similar relationships to xenophobia, to anti-Black racism, to anti-immigrationism, to all sorts of things, Islamophobia, right, the fear of the migrant. I could go on. One of the things that proved to be quite comical near the end of this project was that because the journal Safundi is published through Taylor and Francis, which is based in the United Kingdom, where anti-defamation laws are very, very powerful, the editors came back to everybody in the special issue collection and asked us to defend our claims about things like, is Trump a misogynist? Is Trump a racist? Is Trump an Islamophobe? Is Brexit a policy that is anti-immigrant, and so on? And so those of us who contributed to the special issue spent a couple of days searching the internet for prior claims, in other words, things that were already in the public domain that demonstrated that, yes, in fact, Trump is a racist, et cetera, et cetera. So in all of this, South Africa stands out a bit because I think most of us in our virtual Zoom room today are familiar with what's currently taking place in the United States. Britain, of course, is also, well, maybe no longer, but in principle still a white majority nation. South Africa sticks out because obviously it's at the southern tip of the African continent, and it is a Black majority country and society. So how to explain why I think that all three are knit together by the problem of anti-Black racism? And this is basically what I'm trying to get at in my brief talk today. So there are clearly some underlying structural foundational questions that seem to organize all three of these societies, their politics, their economies, and the expectations around how particularly Black people are treated, but of course minorities in general. So that is essentially the premise here. And I just wanted to read for you very briefly how I introduced this article entitled Trump, Zuma, Brexit, Anti-Black Racism and the Truth of the World. So the echoes and parallels of the current political, economic, and social moment across the distinct national geographies of South Africa, the United States, and the United Kingdom suggest two things. One, that white supremacy, neoliberal capitalism, and extreme inequality are foundational to the current world order. And two, that South Africa offers a very particular perspective. The paradox of anti-Black racism in South Africa, the fact that Black people remain the primary extractive targets of racial capitalism, despite the country's democratic transition in 1994, begins to show how intractable the problem of racial capitalism is, both in its geographical extent and given its historical reach from the moment of the rise of Atlantic capitalism into the present. So I'll get to what I mean by anti-Black racism, but let me first show you a few slides. All right. I'm assuming everyone can see that, right? So, and I'm going to explain a little bit later why I'm talking about Luta Continua. All right. So, all the historians who may be in the room are going to probably feel that this is incredibly reductive, but I think it's worth thinking about shared histories. And those shared histories, of course, take on somewhat different trajectories in South Africa and the United States. The time spans are different, but I do think that there are some structural, foundational, organizing principles of why South Africa and the United States come to look as they do. And as you can see from my two very reductive lists, both of them with 5 things on them, both South Africa and the United States share histories of settler colonialism. In the South African case, these are primarily people arriving in the 17th century as a function of the establishment of a trading post at the Cape of Good Hope. So through a joint venture, the East India Company, and these are primarily, in the first instance, Dutch traders. Eventually, there are folk who arrive from, well, they're Huguenots actually. So Huguenots fleeing persecution. And over the course of at least a century or so, a number of other Europeans, and then of course, the British. And eventually South Africa, as we now know it, is essentially shared territorially between British interests and Dutch interests. I'm not going to go in detail into the history of South African colonialism. But in any case, the United States and South Africa share this problem, really, of settler colonialism. They also share the tragedy of indigenous genocide. South Africa does still have indigenous people, Khoi and Khoikhoi and other groups. Those languages are quite threatened, and in fact are not included as part of the 11 official languages of contemporary South Africa, things like Namakwa and Griqua and so on. Both countries have chattel slavery, and you'll see that the dates are slightly different. So chattel slavery is introduced into South Africa a year after the arrival of Dutch traders in 1653, and concludes in 1834. And of course, most of you will know the history of chattel slavery in the United States. I will say, and again, my historian colleagues may be able to help me here, that the South African history profession is not particularly focused on that early history of chattel slavery in South Africa. And I feel like there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the slave archive in South Africa, which is radically distinct from the ways that we think about it in the United States, which also means that as a relatively undeveloped field, I think it's not a place that people go to thinking about, what other places has chattel slavery existed? So it's very much, in principle, a concern for people working in the Americas. Now, these are not, of course, comparable, but item number 4, so there's a period of what's referred to as the color bar, and then eventually in 1948, the establishment of apartheid, which I would argue is a constitutionally mandated system of white supremacy. Obviously, the timeline for Confederacy, Civil War, Reconstruction, and then eventually Jim Crow is rather different. But certainly, one could make some comparisons between apartheid and Jim Crow. Jim Crow, of course, being a segregationist system, but not a regional segregationist system, let me put it that way. And it's always difficult to make these comparisons given the scale. You know, I always think that talking about the anti-apartheid struggles, for example, is more like talking about the Civil War in the United States, as opposed to a civil rights movement, which seems in a scalar sense rather different. And then finally, this question of the persistence of anti-Black racism, how on earth to explain that in both instances. Okay, so then I have 2 lists of what I see as shared predicaments. And well, oh look, they're exactly the same except for item number 4. So I learn a great deal from my colleagues across disciplines. Of course, this number 1, racial disparities, economic, social, educational, medical, one could go on and on and on. I'm thinking particularly of my colleague, Sandy Darity, who works on inequality economics, amongst many, many things. And certainly in the United States, the disparity along lines of race is extraordinary. So I don't know exactly what the most recent numbers are, but I do recall that in the past that he's cited, you know, if you were to think about aggregate household or family wealth, inclusive of what's in the bank, what you own in the way of property, a few other assets, on aggregate, white families across the United States might have about $90,000 to $100,000 worth of wealth. And in Black households, that gets reduced to about $6,000. So it's not even 1/10, right? In South Africa, the disparities are even greater. So if the United States measure of inequality has climbed to 0.48, you want to be as close to 0 and as far away from 1 as possible, as measured by Gini coefficient. The South African Gini coefficient, I believe, is around 0.62, which is very, very high. In South Africa, at least for a relatively well-developed or emerging market economy, is considered to be the most unequal society globally. Okay, I'm borrowing here from Ruth Gilmore, who argues that racism is really definable as state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. I think this is as true in South Africa as it is in the United States, and of course, no more true than at this moment during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then there's something interesting here, number 3 and 4 on both sides of the equation. Widespread anti-Black racism in South Africa and of course in the United States. And then here's the rub. Oh, South Africa is a Black majority country. And by a sizable amount, we're talking along the lines of about 80-20 or 85-15, right, in percentages. All right. So I thought for the purposes of this talk, because I need to be brief, I would focus on a 2-year span. And there are many ways that one could update this moment to the present. But I'm thinking about 2014 to 2016, when there are things that seem to be happening both in the United States and in South Africa. They're not exactly the same things, but they are definitely struggles against anti-Black racism. They take on, at times, very similar expression, and at times rather radically different expression. So the first is, well, actually, I'm not doing it in order, so I apologize. So this is 2015, 2016 in South Africa. And the emergence across pretty much all 27 of South Africa's public universities of a demand by students, not only Black students, but students of other sort of ethnic origins and racial descent, a demand that government provide free education. And fees in South Africa is basically the word for tuition, right? This is an image taken by photojournalist Shen Scott from some of the early demonstrations on the campus of the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And these demands for essentially the abolition of, or the removal, the striking of tuition really starts to spread across the university system. When I say 27 public institutions, this is a little complicated by the fact that, not unlike in the United States, there are historically Black colleges and universities. They don't have exactly the same or parallel meaning or significance as they might have in the United States. So arguably, in both instances, they have been institutions at one time or another mobilized to actually effectuate segregation of education at the higher education tertiary level. So this is primarily about those institutions that are taken over by government after the transition to democracy in 1994, many of which are historically white institutions that over the course of about 20 years undergo what's referred to as massification, as more and more students, now Black students, are permitted to apply to those institutions, are admitted. And as more and more students apply and are admitted, government begins to not so much reduce the overall amount of money contributed to those institutions, but rather reduces the per capita amount contributed for each student. And by 2015, 2016, this reaches a boiling point, and across the country, the university system is effectively shut down. Okay, So along with the demand for the reduction or the striking of tuition and the promotion of free education, precisely to afford Black students in particular access and opportunity in tertiary education as the one way that many of them imagine that they will begin to enjoy upward mobility. There are also other kinds of conversations that are much more about the symbols of the former colonial order, and also about questions around decolonizing curriculum, decolonizing higher education. So on one hand, it's an economic question, and on the other, it's a question about epistemologies, about decolonizing higher education as a site in which, well, really, a lot of institutions in South Africa are still playing by the sort of European playbook. This image here is an image of the removal of the Cecil Rhodes Monument on the campus of the University of Cape Town. This is happening in March 2015. And it's triggered, interestingly, by a young, I'm just going to call him an activist, who lives on the outskirts of the city. If you look into the background of that image, you'll see the city of Cape Town sprawling out south and eastwards towards what are referred to as the Cape Flats, where a majority of Black people live in abject poverty, in corrugated iron shacks, without running water, certainly without access to a sewage system, many of them without proper flush toilets and so on. And so the sort of the action that triggers these demands is this activist transporting of a bucket of feces from his informal settlement on public transport to the University of Cape Town, where he was attending university, and the slushing of this bucket all over the Cecil Rhodes Monument, right? What people refer to in Cape Town as poo wars, right? Politics of shit, basically. So there's something interesting going on here about how different institutions choose to, or rather the students attending those institutions choose to go for distinct sorts of targets. And the University of the Witwatersrand, which is up in the northern part of the country and mining country, take on questions of the economics primarily. They also take on the question of unionizing, or certainly what would be referred to in South Africa as insourcing facilities workers. So ensuring that they have permanent contracts, that they are directly employed by the University of the Witwatersrand and are paid a living wage. At the University of Cape Town, which is regarded as the Oxford of Africa, right? The questions seem to revolve around the symbolics of the former colonial order. And in some ways I can understand this from having experienced both campuses, that in a way the University of Witwatersrand has a sort of working class urban feel, and the University of Cape Town is very much primed to sort of behave like Oxbridge. This image is very interesting. So this is Sitembile and Sizani, and by that I mean this, oops, wrong, oh dear, wrong way, excuse me for a minute. This young woman here. So this is also interesting symbolically. She is dressed as if a Zimbabwean bird, and she's borrowing from the imagery of liberation struggles in Zimbabwe. So this is what she has to say, standing up March 2015 above the crowd while the Cecil Rhodes Memorial is being removed, or monument is being removed. I was up there for 4 hours. I would hold up my wings for about 2 minutes, take a 10-minute break, and then put them up again. My legs hurt, but I didn't realize how sore my arms were until I came down. They were shaking. My feet were blue. I was sunburnt. I had heat stroke and blurry vision from looking directly into the sun. I went home, had a shower, and went straight to sleep. I felt like we were beginning to question this idealistic rainbow nation. And of course, her reference to the rainbow nation is to Archbishop Desmond Tutu's invocation of the idea of sort of multicolorism, if you will, and multiculturalism in the context of the early post-transition, early democratic era in South Africa in the mid-1990s, when the South African state institutes a reconciliation commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I suppose the message, broadly speaking, is everyone should get along, you know? The truth will set you free, just tell the truth, and we can move on. And of course, this is not what happens. This is a very striking image. University of Cape Town students, the activist students, become very performative. There's a kind of theatrics to what they're trying to communicate. This intervention or situationist action was titled South African Universities Where Dreams Come to Die, right? Because the students really can't access education. Okay, so that's 2015, 2016. A year prior, you have, of course, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the kind of resurgence, if you will, of the movement for Black Lives. And the movement for Black Lives is really inaugurated by the death of Trayvon Martin, murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. But Ferguson seems to congeal a series of questions about, of course, police brutality, murderous behavior on the part of police. Ferguson is a very particular place as a city on the outskirts of St. Louis that is one of many small towns which are unincorporated and consequently have their own police departments and their own municipal courts. This is against the backdrop, of course, of St. Louis's long-term deindustrialization. And very frankly, the fact that increasingly municipal revenues are accrued through court fines and fees, right? Through fining people for small infractions like jaywalking. This is, by the way, in a town or a small city with virtually no sidewalks, but that's another matter. Stop and frisks and so on. And so even though Michael Brown's death or murder is not directly related to those questions, I would argue that what congeals around his death and the conduct of the Ferguson Police Department is a whole series of other questions about the ways in which Black people in the city of Ferguson, and more broadly speaking in these other unincorporated towns and small cities, and of course in the city of St. Louis itself, are really required to generate municipal revenue. And in so doing, of course, are brought into the system of incarceration and jails and so on. So it seems to me there's something very interesting going on here. And I don't have an image here or a slide for this, but I certainly recall being, of course, very involved in Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall watching from afar in 2015, but also recalling that by 2015, there's the coincidence between the resurgence of the movement for Black Lives and these hashtag movements in South Africa, specifically in the context of what's going on the campus of the University of Missouri system, where students are now really emboldened to make louder demands and to protest more loudly things that they've been saying for years about the anti-Black racism on that campus and within that university system as a whole, which eventually brings about the resignation of the system president, who is a CEO, has never really worked in the higher education space, seemed quite clueless, and frankly, his policies were racist. And of course, in that instance, the compelling thing, I suppose, is I certainly was watching on breathless, worrying about a single lone graduate student who'd gone on a hunger strike. No one's really paying attention to this on the University of Missouri campus. But when the football team decides that they're not going to play football season, then everything changes, and it's a domino effect. So, of course, this is a very familiar image for everyone, I'm sure. And by the way, I don't have any images for, I didn't include them. I do have images, but I didn't include them in this slide deck. But this image looks like the South African campuses by the beginning of January of 2016, as the fees must fall and roads must fall protests begin to escalate. So South African universities, administrations, they're referred to as management in South Africa, determine that what they should be doing is bringing riot police onto campus and also private security companies, and things very quickly escalate. But it looks like this. So this to me is a very interesting image. Okay, the other place that I see a really interesting continuity, and again, I'm not doing the deep historical work here, I'm just trying to think about these two places at the same time, is if you have on one hand, hashtag Roads Must Fall, which very quickly in March spreads to Roads Must Fall Oxford, which of course is the home of Oriel College, which is where Cecil Rhodes donated some of his vast fortune. And students there have already tried to have a statue there, or a kind of, I think it's a plaque or something, removed. And the Oxford administration is quite adamant that's not on, and they're not having a conversation about that. British racism is fascinating. It's all done by just not talking about anything, which makes it impossible to talk about anything. So it's really quite an intractable situation. But again, I mean, we could talk about Durham and the removal of the Confederate soldier statue downtown, right, a few summers ago, or the eventual removal of Silent Sam at UNC. And then, of course, things like this image in the midst of the Justice for George Floyd protests this past summer, right? So this is an image, a projected image of Harriet Tubman on the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia, which I understand as of this morning, though there will be a rebuttal of some sort in the courts, I'm sure, it has in fact been judged that it is legal to remove the Robert E. Lee statue from downtown Richmond. Anyway, so I find this a very interesting image. And then, of course, Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, which you might argue is likely the replacement. It's already in Richmond, Virginia. It was unveiled in the middle of Times Square in New York earlier this year or last year. And yeah, I mean, there's so much that one could say about this image. So these are the kinds of connections I'm drawing. And again, it's pretty shallow history at this point, but obviously there are structural questions at the heart of why both of these societies operate as they do. The Luta Continua, the struggle continues, a vitória é certa, which is the Portuguese for "and victory is certain," is drawn from the struggles for emancipation or liberation in Mozambique in the 1960s and 1970s. It's an expression that then travels from a post-independence Mozambique. Samora Machel would sort of announce this at the beginning of rallies and so on. He's the first president of an independent Mozambique. And really captures the imagination of South Africans, who, of course, have to labor for another 2 decades before they experience liberation, which by the mid-1990s is now, of course, referred to as the transition to democracy, as opposed to an emancipatory or liberatory project. Okay. So the last thing I want to say, and then I would really love to invite questions, is so this question of, how is it possible that two places on the map, or if you want to include the UK, 3 places on the map, seem to operate by similar logics, despite the fact that, you know, talking about anti-Black racism in South Africa is a pretty complicated thing to do, given the fact of a Black majority population, of course, a Black-led government, and so on. And so while I don't have time to really explore this here, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this. I think that what I want to say about this is the following, and it forces me to define this term that I used at the beginning of my talk, racial capitalism. For me, I think capitalism is always racial capitalism, in as much as capitalism seeks to create distinctions. These may be distinctions of taste, of consumption, of choice, but also distinctions of race and other kinds of forms of human life. And given the history, and this of course is not everyone's cup of tea theoretically, but if you believe that 1492 is historically a watershed, that what happens in the Atlantic world, in the Black Atlantic, the so-called discovery of the Americas, right? And the de facto use of slave labor in the project of an emergent capitalist modernity, then race always seems to be at the heart of the capitalist project and is, in a sense, in the DNA of capitalism. It seems foundational to its logic. So this is why I had these two lists at the beginning, you know, why South Africa and the United States seem to share things like settler colonialism, which of course is a project of extraction and exploitation, why they share in indigenous genocide, why they share in chattel slavery, and why they seem to share in grave inequality that is always already racialized. So there's a fairly, what shall I say, heated debate in South Africa of the last few years about whether South African scholars are permitted to refer to the system of capitalism in South Africa as white monopoly capitalism. And there are political reasons why this is apparently not appropriate, because it lumps everyone in together. It suggests that there has been no redistribution. It suggests also that you can disarticulate who owns what. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do. But here's what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to stop. So I think that, you know, in as much as questions of ownership and investment and control of capital are very complicated, and there have been attempts to redistribute wealth in a very small way in South Africa, it's difficult also to talk about degrees of direct or indirect relationship to investment and ownership. I do think one thing is abidingly true in the South African situation, which is that Black labor, and this is to say people still fortunate enough to actually be able to labor, who are employed in a country with approximately 30% unemployment, and that's just those who are counted who have stopped recently searching for work, right? So insofar as Black labor is hugely exploited, right? And at times is also just simply cast out of the system of employment and made superfluous to it or redundant, right? The structure of the South African political economy is such that Black people are usually either targets of predation and exploitation or are made manifestly disposable to the system. But in neither circumstance can it be said that the majority of Black South Africans can be considered beneficiaries of the system. And so in that sense, I would argue that, yeah, South Africa operates by a certain kind of racial or racist logic. So I want to leave it there, and I invite your questions.
Anne-Maria, can I kick the Q&A off with a question for you?
Yeah.
Thanks for that. That was really, it's a great project. It's a really great project, and I hope you continue with it. So what about anti-immigrant politics in the two countries? Here, it's so clearly a racial project, even more so under Trump, but I would say it always has been. And in South Africa, you know, where the immigrants are from, you know, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, a bit all over Southern Africa, Congo, and so on. Would you also call it a racial project there? Or is it more a xenophobic, you know, anti-foreigner project?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the language that people use on both sides. So it's a xenophobic project for sure. It's not something I work on specifically, but I mean, there's something odd going on there, that there was a moment in South African anti-apartheid politics and anti-apartheid struggles when the notion of Pan-Africanist solidarity was the thing. And of course, South Africans who fled South Africa of every stripe were welcomed into countries outside, right, outside South Africa's borders. And these days, when foreign-born Africans within South Africa are demonized, and you know the usual scapegoating discourse emerges, some of the countries that were most welcoming of South Africans in exile, those nationals are the most reviled, right? So I'm thinking about Nigeria's incredible generosity during the anti-apartheid struggles, and now South Africans have fallen prey or fallen into the trap of saying, oh, well, you know, everyone knows that Nigerians are criminals, and never mind that they're taking away our jobs, but they're also thieves, etc. All the stuff that you and I are well familiar with. And former President Zuma fanned the flames of this, I think, in a kind of last-ditch effort, as he saw that he was losing grip on power, to encourage ordinary South Africans to see, you know, a zero-sum game. Now, in that sense, I think that's quite similar to the US and sort of Trumpism. It's obviously not a pigmentocracy, a pigment question, but it is a phenotypical question. So people will say in local communities, you can tell that people are not South Africans. You can tell that they are from Somalia. There's usually East Africans are the ones who are caught out, as it were. So I would argue that, you know, because racism, if you think about someone like Foucault and other theorists of race in a very general sense, not the way that we might think about it in the US context, but rather in relationship to, you know, the defense of society, the threat to the nation, the national society, and all this, that racism in its most general, generic sense is not actually about skin color, right? So, and then it's always about the fear of the enemy, you know, within or something like that. So I think you can still make the argument that it applies.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a racial logic operating there, regardless of the fact that it's Black folks in power and Black foreigners that are threatening the body politic. I mean, it's a racial logic through and through. It's just, the terms are quite similar to the ones here. Yeah. You know, along the lines that you argued, I thought really smartly about, you know, racial capitalism in Black majority South Africa.
Yeah. I mean, the weird part is, you know, nobody seems to have any problem with all these white international visitors and foreign investors who come swoop in and, you know, grab what they can, sort of accumulation by dispossession style, and off they go and offshore all of the wealth that they've just, nobody seems to view them as targets at all. It's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Anne-Maria. This is Miguel Rojas from Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I found lots of connections with the way from the Latin American and Latino perspective. I mean, your entire logic comes from, right? You think about coloniality of power, the work of Aníbal Quijano and colleagues of everybody like Walter Mignolo at Duke University have been doing on trying to identify how the system had created this notions of race, class, gender, the idea of nature, etc. That as a result of the forces of modern capitalism in the 15th century on, and how that somehow was recreated by the British Empire in the way they developed this sort of soft colonialism and the whole discourses of post-colonial, the post-colonial moment in Africa or Southeast Asia, vis-a-vis the coloniality of power in the Americas, right, in which we are still invested completely in a system of power that had created this and produced these societies that are fully racialized, class divided by economic means, repressed by difference or by political subjectivity, etc. And we see all these connections, right? Falling monuments, starting with Columbus in the Caribbean, in Central South America, in the US nowadays. All this like unfolding of forces that are trying to understand how systemic, not only racism, but economic division happens. And of course, in the middle of everything is the idea of the nation state that I think, you represented really well, that even though each one of the historical timelines is different, they are commonalities. And the commonality is then institutionalized through the project of the modern state. And the modern state is flawed by the modern colonial matrix, the institutions of power that are connected to this system of production of society. And that there are sections of that populace that cannot get access, right? There is some social mobility through the 20th century, some welfare state kind of approaches, but when it touches the system in its structural dimension, as Quijano said, there is reaction, and the reaction is repression, right? Then what you show about the universities is very telling. We are in a space, in a university space, in which the discussion of race, I mean, we're discussing it right now, and we have students across, the semester and many years past, trying to elaborate a discourse of how integration is not happening. How social advancement is not happening, how the university is failing its own mission on the issues of social mobility. If we see it, in statistical terms, right? The amount of people from racial minorities coming into the ones that are getting the right jobs into the scale of the economic production of capital. The recreation of labor, service labor through the new means of the society and the way it moves. I mean, we see all sorts of connections here that will make a really interesting comparative project, not only South Africa, Great Britain, the US, but many of these spaces touched by coloniality in the way they have been, and they are still in the middle. Then I applaud your project. Is really interesting in a comparative dimension, is what we need to do to understand how the system still works.
Thanks, Miguel. Yeah, I mean, I suppose some of the things that are really most compelling are the differences. So aside from this University of Missouri story, one of the things that is fascinating to me is the degree to which, and maybe it's because the US in particular is an already heavily indebted society, that students tolerate levels of debt. I mean, I don't think they're happy about it, but this difference, for example, between South African students who will take to the streets, to the campus, do all sorts of things for the question of debt. They don't want to be in debt anymore. They also can't access the university because they can't pay the tuition in the first place, but many of them have been put through a system called NESFAS, which is it's basically like federal loans of some sort. And so there are these interesting differences. I mean, I think, what you're saying about Latin America, for example, I know that some of my colleagues who are doing this work in South Africa are most especially interested about what's going on in Brazil, about which I know very little. The other thing that's a very interesting difference is, and I mentioned this, is the way that the British Academy, gosh, responds to these kinds of demands. I mean, Rhodes for Oxford was quite a production, very performative, extremely responsible to an intellectual project around decoloniality. And the students brought in all sorts of different kinds of people. I mean, local officials of color, people who had been active in other decades around anti-racism in Britain, also intellectuals who were in the decolonial space, put together a volume, student, edited and all that. Pretty amazing. And the British response is just, they're not going to talk about it. I mean, the numbers are unbelievable. So the last time that Oxford was willing even to release, even though they're supposed to be numbers that are part of the public record, numbers about how many students of African descent had been admitted to Oxford across its multiple colleges and a student body of over 20,000 was, I think, in 2011, when they admitted that they had admitted 34. So the whole, I can't quite put it in words. I don't have vocabulary for it, but I know as soon as I land in Britain, I can feel it. That version of post-imperialism and that version of racism is just, wow, it's its own thing. It's quite different from the US or South Africa, and presumably in a place like Brazil or somewhere else in the Americas. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, John French has been working really heavily on the issues of racial representation in universities in Brazil, and they have a beautiful project comparing Black Lives Matter, Brazil, US, that is a remarkable project. And just to remember that Chile now is moving to rewrite their constitutions thanks to university students that started a number of protests a couple of years ago, asking for relief on their debt on the university debt and investment for more public university. And now they are rewriting. I mean, they just won the referendum last week, and they are trying to reshuffle the country coming out of 40 years of neoliberal policies.
Yeah. I see
the last moment of global capital.
Yeah. I see a question in the chat from Maybell. And the question is, can you discuss what, you've put it in scare quotes, colored means in South Africa, and how race construction in South Africa includes or excludes Native people? It's a great question. So colored people, spelled in South Africa with a U, and usually capitalized, actually, interestingly, are people of mixed racial descent, broadly speaking. And that mixed racial descent tends to be regionally different. So I'm thinking about places like the Northern Transvaal and into the Northern Cape, where this might be people who, I mean, it's very hard to say, right? And one doesn't want to sort of go down the rabbit hole of who is what and how and what color and so on. But let me put it this way. Broadly speaking, people who are descended from African people, indigenous people, and European people. And certainly in the place where I've done a lot of work in the past, in the Western Cape, in and around Cape Town, colored people define themselves as much as anything through language, which is that they're Afrikaans speaking first, English speaking second. So, but, you know, with the emergence of these kind of new radical politics amongst a younger generation of people who are born after 1994 and refer to themselves and are referred to as born frees, right? So they're born into democracy. I think that distinction, for some anyway, is less important. That if they're in with the program of the struggle, then they would refer to themselves as being Black. And that's sort of how I take it. In terms of indigenous identification, it's not really my field, so I feel a little bit cautious to tread. But when I was in South Africa last year and I went to a big public award ceremony, the award ceremony organizers had a series of school children who read a portion of the South African Constitution in a South African language. Now, officially, there are only 11 official languages, but there are way more than that because there are internal differentiations between one version of Southern Sotho and another version of Southern Sotho. But what was interesting was that there was one young woman who read a portion of the Constitution in Griqua. That was a first. And then there has been, which is something entirely different, the promotion of South African Sign Language. So someone also signed. But this is really not terribly on the radar in the way that English and to some degree Afrikaans continue to be the two languages in which state documents are written, the law is read, and so on. So it's a difficult question for me to answer. I think we're at 1 o'clock.
We are. So we thank you so much for being here, all of you, and also for Dr. Makhulu for sharing her important work and project with us today. Thanks to DUCIGS, the John Hope Franklin Center, and the Africa Initiative for supporting our talk. Be sure to check out the website for the next event in the John Hope Franklin and Global Anti-Racism series, and make sure to vote if you're able. Have a great day, everyone.